The moment the assassin's boots touched down on the planet's surface, Celine Ward knew he was here. The soft hum of her medical equipment was drowned out by the unmistakable thrum of impending danger. She'd felt it since the moment she'd received the message. An assassin was on his way. But it wasn't just any assassin. It was the Shadow, the ghost feared throughout the galaxy. No one escaped him. And that's why she had to. Celine took a slow, measured breath as she wiped down an examining table, her hands steady despite the storm raging in her chest. Her role here was simple: nurse, healer, comforter. A life she'd built for herself after years of darkness. A life she was about to lose. Again, the assassin had no idea who he was hunting. The ship's signal was barely a whisper against the stars, but to someone trained to listen for it, it was enough. His presence was nothing more than a whisper in the wind, just another shadow amongst the countless others that filled the colony's bustling streets. He had his mission, and he would carry it out with deadly efficiency, unaware of the woman who was just as deadly, hidden behind her innocent facade. Celine's eyes scanned the busy ward through the corner of her vision. Staff and patients moved in a blurred rhythm, oblivious to the danger lurking at their doorstep. She had been a nurse for years now, long enough to make this role her own. But she wasn't just a healer. Not anymore. Her mind flashed to the past. Nights spent in training rooms, learning to kill without hesitation, without mercy. The skills drilled into her were still there, buried deep, like a dormant volcano waiting to erupt. Her time as a deadly operative was supposed to be over, but now with the shadow closing in, she felt the coldness creep back in. Her fingers brushed the hilt of a concealed weapon beneath her uniform, hidden in plain sight. She didn't want to use it. She didn't want to fall back into that life. But the assassin would not be stopped by kindness. And if she didn't act soon, he would strike without warning. Outside the window, the faint outline of his figure appeared, a black silhouette against the neon lights of the city. He moved with precision, as always, blending seamlessly with the urban landscape. His weapon was ready. His target was close. But he didn't know she was already watching him. Celine's heart pounded in her chest, but her breath remained even. She moved toward the back room, shutting the door behind her, and closed her eyes for a moment. The feeling of danger wrapped itself around her like a suffocating shroud. It was a familiar feeling, one she'd trained for years to suppress. But now, in the quiet tension before the storm, it surged to the surface again. She was no longer just a nurse, and the assassin would soon realize that he had hunted the wrong prey. She wasn't the victim. She was the hunter. As the assassin's footsteps drew nearer, Celine's hand clenched around the weapon's grip. A cold smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Let him come. He wouldn't be the first to underestimate her, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. She had waited for this moment for years. The silence of the hospital was both a comfort and a reminder. Celine moved through the sterile halls, her steps measured, her expression neutral. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, a countdown that only she seemed to hear. It wasn't a matter of if the assassin would come. It was a matter of when. Her hands moved with practiced ease as she adjusted medical charts, tending to the few remaining patients who hadn't been transferred to other facilities. Their faces were kind, unaware of the danger lurking just outside the doors. They trusted her, and she had earned it. But trust, she knew, was a dangerous thing. She was still herself, at least in their eyes. The nurse who cared for their wounds, who comforted their children, who healed the sick. But the truth was buried deeper, a truth that had been dormant for too long. Years ago, she had been part of a secret military operation designed to create the perfect soldier, one who could blend in with any population, who could heal with one hand and kill with the other. Her training was ruthless. It had taken everything from her, her humanity, her past, her identity, but it had never been meant to be permanent. She had walked away, disappeared into a life of normalcy. Or so she had hoped. The message had shattered that illusion. A simple warning, a single name, the Shadow. Celine's fingers hovered over the edge of a medical tray, the cold steel a grounding force. Her breathing steadied as memories flooded her mind. The combat simulations, the bloodstained missions, the lethal precision drilled into her until it was second nature. She was no longer just the nurse who tended to wounds. She was a weapon, a survivor, someone who had learned to trust only one thing: herself. Her gaze flickered to the security monitors in the corner of the room. Static filled the screen for a moment before the familiar shape of the assassin appeared. His movements were slow, deliberate. He was close, too close. But he still didn't know. Celine took a breath, steadying her nerves. The assassin might be hunting her, but he had no idea what he was up against. She'd learned to blend in, to become invisible. She'd learned how to remain silent, unnoticed, even as she killed. And now, that training would save her life. She stood still for a moment, allowing the quiet to settle around her like a cloak. The calm was a lie. The storm was coming. But she had been in this position before, cornered, hunted, outnumbered. And she had always survived. This time would be no different. Her fingers brushed against the hidden weapon beneath her uniform once again, the cool metal familiar and reassuring. She wasn't afraid. She had faced worse. She had faced things that would have broken lesser people, things that had scarred her deeply. But that had been a lifetime ago. Now the only thing that mattered was survival. She moved, fluid and silent, through the halls, her eyes never leaving the security feed. Each step was calculated, measured. The assassin was in the building, and he would be searching for her soon. But she had the advantage. She knew the layout, the hidden rooms, the blind spots in the system. She had everything planned. The only question now was how far she would be willing to go to survive. She had left that life behind, but it had never really left her. And now, she would have to confront it head-on. As the lights flickered briefly, signaling a power surge, Celine felt the familiar stirrings of tension, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. The assassin was near. She could hear his footsteps now, muffled by the thick walls. But she was ready. The game had begun. And this time, she would not be the prey. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, Celine knew it was too late to turn back. The assassin was inside, his presence a cold, invisible weight pressing against the walls of the hospital. She could feel him, even before his shadow appeared at the far end of the hallway. Silent, calculating, like a predator stalking its prey. She had been waiting for this, waiting for him to make his move. But now that it was happening, the calm she had maintained for so long shattered, replaced by a sharp, familiar clarity. She moved quickly, her training taking over. Every step was deliberate, every motion purposeful. The hallway was dimly lit, the soft hum of the ventilation system the only sound that filled the air. She moved with precision, her eyes constantly flicking between the security cameras and the shadows that seemed to shift around her. The assassin wasn't far. She knew his style. Slow, deliberate, letting the fear of his presence work in his favor. He wasn't just hunting her. He was savoring the chase. Celine ducked into a side room, her breath steady despite the rising tension. She had one advantage. She knew the layout of the hospital better than anyone. She knew where the cameras were, where the hidden pathways were, where the exits were. The assassin would have to play by her rules now. Her hand brushed against the concealed weapon beneath her uniform, a comforting weight. She had never wanted to use it, but now the reality was unavoidable. She was no longer just a nurse. She was the hunter, and he was about to learn that the game had changed. The assassin's footsteps grew closer. The sound was almost imperceptible, but to someone trained to listen it was deafening. He was on the move again, trying to flush her out, trying to anticipate her every move. But Celine was prepared. She had anticipated this long before he had even arrived. She stepped out of the side room, moving silently toward the hospital's central corridor. She could hear the assassin's breathing now low and steady, as he methodically searched each room. He was getting closer. It was time. Celine moved into position, her muscles tense with the weight of what was about to happen. The assassin's form appeared in the doorway, his figure blocking out the light as he stepped into the room. He was fast, his movements sharp, but she was faster. With a quick, fluid motion, Celine struck, her hand coming up from behind him to press the muzzle of her hidden weapon to the back of his neck. The assassin froze, the surprise evident in the tension that shot through his body. "Not what you expected, was it?" Celine's voice was steady, cold. The assassin didn't move, his eyes flickering toward the weapon, but not reacting. For a moment, they stood there, locked in a tense standoff, the weight of the situation settling over them both. "You're good," the assassin said, his voice low and dangerous. "But you're not good enough." Celine's fingers tightened around the grip of her weapon. She could feel the energy in the room shift, the air crackling with the raw intensity of their confrontation. He wasn't scared. He didn't fear her. He was confident, almost too confident. But that was his mistake. Without warning, Celine shifted, using her superior agility to twist the assassin's arm behind his back, disarming him in one swift motion. The assassin's eyes flashed with realization, but it was too late. She wasn't the prey. She wasn't just a nurse. And now, she wasn't just surviving. She was taking control. The assassin's body tensed as he fought for control. But Celine was already steps ahead, her movements a blur of practiced precision. She pushed him down to the ground with a force that sent a shockwave through the room. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The assassin's gaze met hers, calculating, focused. "You've underestimated me," Celine whispered, a thin smile playing at her lips. The assassin's eyes narrowed, but Celine knew something he didn't. He had just lost the game. As she stood over him, weapon ready, the real fight was only just beginning. In the stillness of the room, Celine realized she had made a mistake. The assassin lay on the ground, stunned but not defeated. His body was tense beneath her grip, but there was no fear in his eyes. Only calculation. He had underestimated her once, but now with every move she made, he was adapting, learning. The hunt had only intensified. "You can't kill me," he said, his voice low, almost amused. "Not the way you think." Celine froze, her weapon still trained on him. She had expected resistance, but not this. This calm, this unnerving confidence that radiated from him even as he lay there, disarmed and vulnerable. "Who sent you?" she demanded, her voice sharp. He chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You really don't know, do you? The people who trained you didn't just make you a weapon. They made you a target." Celine's mind raced. She had left that life behind. She had thought she was free. But now, with his words hanging in the air, doubt crept in. "They sent you because of me," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The assassin didn't answer at first, just staring up at her with those calculating eyes. And then, finally, he spoke. "You were always the perfect candidate. Trained to heal, trained to kill. You never stood a chance." Something in her snapped. He was right. They had chosen her for her potential, for her ability to walk both sides of the line, to kill without hesitation and heal with the same hands. They hadn't just made her a weapon. They had crafted her for a purpose. And now, that purpose was coming back to haunt her. Celine took a deep breath, forcing herself to refocus. She wasn't going to let him win, not like this. She had escaped their control once. She would do it again. With a swift motion, she kicked the assassin's weapon further out of reach and took a step back. Her pulse quickened, but she steadied her breath, fighting the instincts that urged her to finish this now. She had the power. She had the upper hand. But something about this situation didn't sit right. "Why didn't you just kill me when you had the chance?" she asked, her voice tight. The assassin smirked. "Because I needed you to remember. You think you've outrun them, but they never let go." "Not really." His words hit like a hammer, but Celine didn't flinch. She couldn't. She had to stay focused. But even as she met his gaze, the unsettling truth gnawed at her. The organization that had trained her had never let her go. They'd just let her think she had escaped. She was a piece in a larger game. And now, that game was reaching its final move. For a brief moment, Celine allowed herself to think back on everything she had been, everything she had done. The covert operations, the bloodshed, the loneliness. And then just as quickly, she shoved it all aside. She had to remain the woman she was now. A healer. A survivor. She crouched down, bringing herself eye level with the assassin. "You're wrong," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not your weapon anymore." His eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Celine's hand shot forward. In one fluid motion, she restrained him, securing his wrists with a strength that surprised even her. The assassin struggled, but the effort was futile. "Your time is up," Celine said coldly. "I'm not running anymore." The assassin's eyes blazed with anger, but beneath the fury, there was a flicker of something else. Fear. And that fear, more than anything, told her everything she needed to know. She had won, but the war was far from over. As she stood over him, the weight of the situation settled in. She had taken control, but now she had a choice. Kill him, or use him to get the answer she needed. Both options were dangerous, but one of them would give her a chance to truly break free. And as she locked eyes with him, she knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The reckoning was far from over. The walls were closing in, and Celine felt the pressure with every breath. The assassin, though restrained, refused to break. His defiance radiated from him like a storm, his eyes cold and unyielding. It was clear now, he had no intention of begging for mercy, no desire to offer her any answers willingly. He was a soldier to the end, and that made him dangerous. Celine stood over him, her pulse still steady despite the rising tension. The weight of the situation settled heavily in her chest. She was in control, but she knew that control could slip away in an instant. He wasn't just an assassin. He was a piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle she didn't yet understand. And the longer she let him live, the more dangerous he became. She paced the small room, her mind racing. What did he know? Who had sent him? More importantly, what did he know about her? About the people who had trained her, shaped her into this weapon she had become? The assassin's gaze never wavered, his lips curling into a faint smile that only made her more uneasy. He was waiting for her to make a mistake, to underestimate him. But that wasn't going to happen. Not this time. "Talk," Celine said, her voice low and firm. "Tell me who sent you. I need to know who's behind this." He didn't answer at first. His silence was suffocating, but Celine wasn't going to back down. She had been trained to break people, to extract information with nothing but her will. And though she had walked away from that life, it was still there, a tool at her disposal. "I don't talk to people like you," he finally said, his voice bitter. "People like me?" Celine's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "The nurse," he spat, his voice filled with disdain. "You think they'll just let you walk away from what you are? They trained you to kill. They trained you to be a weapon. They'll never let you go." His words hit harder than she expected. The cold truth of it, the realization that her past wasn't just some dark chapter. It was still alive, waiting to claim her. She had been running from it for years, but now it was here, staring her in the face. "Who?" she demanded again, her patience running thin. "Who are they?" The assassin smiled almost sadly. "You don't get it, do you? You were never supposed to escape. You were made to serve them, to be their perfect soldier. And when they call for you, you'll come. You'll kill for them. And you'll forget everything else." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She had heard enough. She couldn't afford to waste time on him anymore. He had told her what she needed to know, but the truth left her with more questions than answers. The weight of her training, the blood on her hands, it was all still there, still lingering beneath the surface. She had built a life for herself, a life she'd fought hard to keep. But that life was fragile. and she was beginning to understand just how easily it could be shattered. Without warning, Celine moved, grabbing the assassin by the collar and pulling him close. She could feel his heart racing, could feel the tension in his body as he prepared to fight back. But this wasn't about a fight. It was about power control. "Tell me what I need to know," she said, her voice cold and hard. The assassin's eyes narrowed, but he didn't answer. He was testing her, pushing her to see how far she would go. But Celine had no more time for games. With a swift, practiced motion, she drove a blade into his side, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to make him understand. The assassin gasped, but his defiance remained, his gaze unwavering. "Enough games," she said, her voice a low whisper. "Tell me who sent you, or I'll finish what I started." The room was silent, but for the sound of his labored breathing. The assassin's smirk faded, and for the first time, Celine saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. She had broken him just a little. But was it enough to break the chain? To free her from the shadows that still held her? The clock was ticking. The past was coming for her, and there was no more running. Not anymore. The moment the door slammed shut, Celine knew there was no turning back. The assassin was still breathing, still conscious but barely. Blood stained his clothes, pooling beneath him, staining the floor where she stood. He had tried to fight her, tried to hold on to his control. But in the end, Celine had forced him to break. The truth had come spilling out, and now the final decision was in her hands. The organization that had created her was real. They had never stopped watching, never stopped controlling. And the assassin? He was nothing more than a messenger, a tool in a much larger game. A game that had been set in motion the moment she was born. She stood over him now, her pulse steady, her breath measured. The power of the situation, the weight of everything she had just learned, was almost overwhelming. But she couldn't afford to let it consume her. Not yet. Not when everything depended on what she did next. The assassin's eyes flickered, meeting hers. There was no anger, no fear, only acceptance. He had known from the beginning that this was how it would end. "Finish it," he rasped. "They'll come for you, whether you kill me or not. You can't outrun them. Not anymore." Celine felt the familiar coldness of her training settle in. But there was something else now, too. Something that made her hesitate. The voice in her head, the one that had kept her alive all these years, was telling her to end it, to make sure there were no loose ends. But there was another voice, softer, quieter. It told her there was still time. Time to make a choice. She took a step back, the weight of her weapon heavy in her hand. Her mind raced. The assassin was right. They would come for her. The people who had created her would stop at nothing to bring her back into their fold. She would never be free. Not unless she made the choice now. The question wasn't whether she could kill him. She had already done that, in a way. It wasn't about revenge. It was about control. It was about whether she could stop running, whether she could finally cut the strings that had held her for so long. Celine knelt beside him, her gaze hard, but something in her softened as she looked into his eyes. He was just another pawn, just another victim of the same system that had shaped her. She wasn't going to become what they wanted. Not again. "I'm not your weapon anymore," she said, her voice quiet but firm. With one swift motion, she pressed her weapon into the ground beside him, signaling the end of the fight. The assassin didn't resist. He didn't beg for his life. He just stared up at her, a resigned look in his eyes. Celine stood, her decision made. She couldn't destroy the system alone, but she could walk away from it. She could survive, and she could make sure others like her didn't fall into its grasp. The assassin let out a soft breath, his body sinking into unconsciousness. But Celine didn't stay to watch. She turned and left the room, moving swiftly through the shadows. There was no time to waste. The game wasn't over, but the rules had changed. As she disappeared into the darkness, she knew the next phase of the battle had already begun. She had made her choice, and now there was no going back. The past would always be a part of her, but it wouldn't define her. The fight for her future had just begun. And this time, she wasn't running anymore.